Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, last week in America, there was another vile and horrific school shooting. And sadly, a lot of young people who were just going about their business, trying to get an education, lost their lives. Now, whenever this kind of situation happens, there is an inevitable and highly emotive and often very irrational, emotionally charged debate that begins to unfold on social media. And this time is no different than what we've seen in some of these previous mass shootings. Here's the thing. I'm going to propose today that anyone who is claiming that we should ban military-style semi-automatic rifles, I would argue that position is not very principled or logical. And if you're going to take that position, then you should also support banning alcohol, because alcohol should be banned for all of the same reasons that you would give for claiming that we should ban military-style semi-automatic weapons. But before I get into that, I want to start by making a couple of points. First of all, if you've come here thinking that you want to accuse me of being some sort of rabid, gun nut, lunatic, weirdo guy who's digging bunkers in his backyard and who's willing to sacrifice school children on the altar of some sort of military personal defense militia type convenience, just stop. Okay, that's not me, and it really is, I think, an absurd and offensive kind of place to start. So I'm not interested in that kind of emotionally charged and just over-the-top rhetoric and hyperbole. If we're going to have a reasonable debate about important issues, reasonable is the important starting point. You've got to start from that place of reason. And I would advise you, if you are someone who is a really, really strong, ardent supporter of gun control or gun bans or whatever the case might be, I think there's three things that you need to remember and do before you engage in any discussion or debate about this issue. Number one, do your research and actually make sure that you understand the statistics and the figures properly. Don't just go one-sided. Get multiple sources to confirm with accuracy what you're talking about. Make sure that you understand the firearms technology that you're talking about. It's amazing how many people still confuse semi-automatic and automatic weapons. They think that a military-style semi-automatic is a gun that you can hold the trigger down and it will release a burst of bullets. That's not what a semi-automatic is. It's one pull of the trigger, one bullet. You have to release and then pull again, release and then pull again each time. It's not an automatic, and automatic weapons have been banned in America for many, many years. But these are the kind of facts that people often don't know because they rush off at 100 miles an hour in a very sort of emotive state or an emotionally charged state, and they don't really get all their facts in order. So make sure you research and understand the laws, you understand the weapons, and you understand the facts and figures involved. So be well informed. Number two, don't call people murderers. Just because people disagree with you or your view on gun control, it doesn't make them a murderer. It doesn't make them a baby killer. They don't have blood on their hands, right? They are people just like you who have a viewpoint. And I would argue that not only is it not reasonable or rational to start from that position when you're engaging with someone on important issues, but it's also strategically, it's really quite stupid, because what it means is people are more likely to shut down and not listen to you. If your starting point, or very quickly into the debate, you want to start calling them baby killers and claiming that they're responsible for the actions of murderous people who engage in mass shootings, then they're just not going to listen. And nor would I, because it's an absurd accusation. And number three, you actually need to have some concrete ideas about policies that you would like to see changed or implemented. So what is it exactly that you're proposing? In order for a debate and a discussion to be rational and to progress well, there's got to be tangible, actual tangible policy ideas being put forward. So what is it that you're actually asking for the general populace to actually support you on? Do you want a ban on military-style semi-automatic weapons? Do you want a licensing system for every gun owner? Do you want annual inspections to ensure that people are storing their guns properly? What is it? What exactly is it that you want? And do you understand those measures well? And I think if you start with those three things in mind, then you're going to have a far more productive discussion with people who might disagree with you on this issue. So let's now talk about this claim, and this is all I really want to address here, is this claim that some people are making that we should ban military-style semi-automatic rifles and that there's no reason for people to own them, and they should be banned outright because they're such a danger and they're such a menace. Well, every reason that's put forward that I have heard so far for people saying why we should ban these weapons altogether, not just restrict them, but ban them altogether, every one of those reasons would also apply to alcohol. So if you support a ban on military-style semi-automatic rifles, if you are a truly principled person who is proposing a logical and not simply an arbitrary position on this issue, you should also support the outlawing, the banning of all alcohol. Here are the reasons that people give, and here's why they apply to alcohol as well. Firstly, people claim that military-style semi-automatic rifles are designed to kill human beings. Well, the same is true of alcohol. It's a toxin that's not really meant to be in your system, and the only reason that you don't get killed by it is because you limit and you moderate and you control the way you use it. The same is true of firearms, by the way. People don't get killed if they are used responsibly. Again, people don't die from alcohol poisoning if they drink responsibly. So that same argument about being engineered and designed to kill the human being is true of alcohol just as much as it is of military-style semi-automatic weapons. Second point is that people claim that a military-style semi-automatic weapon can kill a lot of people very quickly, and so therefore it's different from other types of guns. Well, again, that is true of alcohol as well. All it would take for alcohol to kill a lot of people very quickly would be for one person to consume too much alcohol and then to get behind the wheel of a car. And let's say they had 3 or 4 passengers in their car, they drove down a motorway, they lost control of their vehicle because they were speeding, and they ended up hitting 3 or 4 other cars. It is very, very conceivable, and it's easy to understand how that sort of an incident could result in the same number of fatalities just as quickly as, possibly even slightly quicker than someone who goes on a mass shooting rampage with a military-style semi-automatic weapon. So it can kill a lot of people very quickly as well. Number 3, no one needs to own a military-style semi-automatic weapon. Now that's true. You won't die if you don't own one. There's no health reason to own one. There's no human need for a military-style semi-automatic weapon, but there's no human need for alcohol either. No human being needs to consume alcohol. If you do not consume alcohol, you will not die. There is no health reason and there is no medical reason. There is no reason for people to be consuming alcohol. There is no human need for alcohol. So again, if it applies to military-style semi-automatics, then surely it would also apply to alcohol. Now, if you enjoy sport shooting, social shooting, you can use other guns. You don't need to use military-style semi-automatics to go target shooting. You can use other types of weapons for target shooting. Now, the same is true of alcohol. If you enjoy drinking beverages, delicious beverages in a public setting and when you're in a social setting, then guess what? You don't need alcohol. There are other drinks that you can drink. You could drink a Coke or a Coke Zero. You could have a fruit juice. You don't need alcohol. There's other drinks that can satisfy your desire to have a drink in your hand on social occasions. Now, of course, people might say that specialists might need access, like military personnel might need access to military-style semi-automatic rifles, so we should have a special, I guess, category of people who are entitled to and legally allowed to access these things. Again, the same is true of alcohol. Perhaps medical specialists might be the people who might need to access it for some sort of emergency anesthetic type situation where they need to cleanse a wound very quickly or cleanse surgical instruments. So those people would have some sort of special exemption, just like it is with this ban that people often propose when it comes to military-style semi-automatic weapons. And lastly, and I guess I wasn't 100% accurate when I started by saying that there is no real difference between alcohol and semi-automatic military-style rifles. There is a huge difference, actually. Both of them kill people. They result in deaths every year. Military-style semi-automatic rifles result in the killing. The fact that people can own them results in the killing of people. Alcohol can also, and also does, kill people every year, but here's the big difference between the two. Alcohol kills a heck of a lot more people every year than what military-style semi-automatic rifles do. So again, I ask, if you're going to claim that we should ban, not simply have restrictions in place, not prudent sort of restrictions, but we're going to ban these weapons altogether, then surely if you're a truly principled person, and this is about a principled stance and protecting people and their well-being and protecting the good of society, then surely you should also be in favour of banning all forms of alcohol. Now, if you're not, I'd like to know why you're not. I can't see a reasoned, logical position for making a distinction there between these two things, right? I can see why it happens, though. The reason it happens and people make this arbitrary distinction is because they're not scared of alcohol. Most of us have been exposed to alcohol in some way or another, and so we understand that alcohol, when it is drunk responsibly by responsible people, poses no threat to anybody. We all understand that it's not the bottle of alcohol that causes a drunk driving accidents. It's not the bottle of alcohol that causes some sort of rage in the home that leads to violence. It's not the bottle of alcohol that might lead to a violent crime. It's the people and the decisions they make. And if they abuse that alcohol and they are irresponsible with that alcohol, then bad things happen. But we are all people who have been so exposed to alcohol, and a lot of us have drunk it, we understand that you can drink it responsibly and you can make safe choices and that we don't need to fear the alcohol. However, when it comes to military-style semi-automatic rifles, not as many members of society have been around them. And so there's almost an aura of fear about these things. People are often scared of them. They're petrified of them. Instead of seeing them as a machine that is a precision machine that can be used responsibly by people who do things like target shooting or sport shooting, instead, people have this aura that they build around them like they're some sort of evil menace, and that, I don't know, if you leave a semi-automatic military-style rifle in the corner, suddenly it's going to jump up and start killing people. It's because we haven't been around them as much, and when you haven't been around something as much, it's very easy to misunderstand or to hold fears, particularly when you are bombarded with a slew of misinformation and fear-mongering about these types of machines. At the end of the day, they are just a machine. They can be used responsibly or they can be used irresponsibly. And because they can be used irresponsibly, by the way, for those who are wondering, I actually do support basic gun control. I think it's a good thing. I live in a country that has basic gun control. In my country, you can own a semi-automatic military-style rifle, and a lot of people do. You can own an AR-15 here in New Zealand. But first of all, in order to own any firearm in New Zealand, you have to have a firearms license. So that involves applying for the license. There's a test that's involved. There's a course that you have to do as part of that as well. And then there's regulations you have to follow. You have to have a locked gun safe, or a way of locking the weapons in your home and keeping them secure and safe so they can't just be easily accessed or burgled out of your home. If you want to own an AR-15, a military-style semi-automatic rifle, you have to add a special category to your license. Once you've acquired that category and you are deemed someone who is reliable and safe enough to have that category, there are certain things that obligations that you have to meet. So you have an annual inspection to ensure that you are actually keeping the firearms somewhere safe, etc. But anyone in my country who applies and is granted the license in a special category, they can legitimately own and use military-style semi-automatic rifles. We don't have a home defense clause in New Zealand, unlike America. You're not allowed to use them for home defense, but you can use them for sport shooting and target shooting and all that sort of stuff, and lots of people do. They take great pleasure and have great fun using these machines in a safe and responsible kind of way, and a lot of people have them. And guess what? We don't have a mass shooting epidemic here in New Zealand at all. Which, by the way, interestingly enough, the other thing that happens in New Zealand here too is that if you commit a criminal offence, or you have a domestic violence restraining order out against you, or you develop mental illness, your guns can be taken away from you in order to protect yourself and wider society as well. So I think these are good and basic and prudent gun laws. Now, what's interesting is our neighbour, Australia, which is just across the ditch, if I was to get on a plane right now and fly from where I live in New Zealand to one of the big Australian cities, it would take me between 3 to 3.5 hours maximum. That's how close they are to us. Now, Australia, our closest neighbour, took a different approach. In 1996, they had something called the Port Arthur Massacre, where a young man went on a rampage with a military-style semi-automatic weapon or semi-automatic weapons, and he killed 35 people. Now, their response to that was to ban military-style semi-automatic weapons in Australia and to impose other restrictions that we don't have in New Zealand. It's a lot harder to own a gun in Australia than what it is in New Zealand. They have a lot more restrictions. You can't own AR-15s in Australia like you can do here in New Zealand. But here's the interesting thing. In New Zealand, we have a murder rate per 100,000 people that is slightly lower than the murder rate per 100,000 people in Australia. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people use the Australian example and say, well, if America just did what Australia did and banned military-style semi-automatic rifles, they would have no more problems. All their problems would be solved. Well, maybe, or maybe not. You see, the other option is they adopt the model that we have here in New Zealand, which is basic, licensing and control laws, which still allow people access to AR-15s and other military-style semi-automatics, or even just regular semi-automatics that are not military-style. And guess what? We don't have this shooting epidemic, this mass shooting epidemic problem. A couple of other things just to finish this video with. Number one, please, please, please don't jump into the comments thread and throw in that silly old tired meme about the Second Amendment and muskets and flintlock pistols. So if you haven't heard this already, it's quite common in these discussions now. People think they're being really clever and chic when they say this. They're really not. It's not a particularly rational thing to say, but they'll say it anyway when they claim the Second Amendment was written at a time when all they had was flintlock pistols and muskets. And so clearly the Second Amendment was only meant to apply to that kind of firearms technology. That is simply not true at all. The Second Amendment, I'm not an American, I don't live in America, and I don't profess to be an expert on constitutional law in America, but one thing I do know is that the Second Amendment doesn't mention any specific or particular type of firearms technology. That's because it was not written for a specific type of firearms technology. Instead, the Second Amendment was written based on an important principle. And that principle was this, that governments can very easily become tyrannies, and they have a huge advantage that puts the people in a very vulnerable position, and that they have armies and armed forces at their disposal. So one way to mitigate that threat is to allow your citizenry to actually own guns themselves, and then if they needed to, they could form an armed militia to defend themselves against an unjust tyranny. That's the principle. Now that principle hasn't changed, that governance of a people can turn into tyranny very easily, and that, of course, governments have armed forces at their disposal. That principle is still just as true today as when it was written all those many, many generations ago when the American Constitution was created. So it's not about the technology of the firearm, it's about the principle. And by the way, that principle, if you're a student of history, if you even just know your history, you should know that in the last 100 years or so, a lot of different regimes have proven how very easily and quickly and very brutal they can become in their tyranny. So that principle certainly hasn't dissipated or become less important with time. In fact, you could probably make a pretty reasoned argument that it's actually become more pressing and important in the last 100 years, that whole principle that underlies the Second Amendment. The other thing I'll say is this, that a lot of people who are proposing bans on guns and who are claiming that if you ban guns, then somehow, safety and good things will happen, and that nothing bad could happen and nothing dangerous could happen, and anyone who's saying otherwise is fear-mongering. A lot of those same people do not hold that same principle to be true when it comes to, say, the issue of abortion. A lot of those same people who are saying you ban guns and human lives will be saved and nothing bad will ever happen by banning them. If I tried to propose, for example, as a pro-lifer that maybe you should restrict or even outlaw abortion, those same people would throw their arms in the air and they would say, no, you can't do that. You can't do that at all. Because if you do that, bad things will happen. People will resort to dangerous backstreet abortions. They will still try and have abortions. You won't stop anybody from actually accessing abortion. But that's the exact opposite of what they say when it comes to banning firearms. So Is it too much to ask here for a little consistency? For someone who holds a particularly strong and militant pro-choice position and who claims you shouldn't restrict it and you can't ban it and bad things will happen and it'll just go underground, to then turn around and say that you can actually effectively do the same thing with firearms and there's not a problem, I'm sorry, that's not consistent. And the other thing I'll say too is this, that what about a conservative who say goes the other way? So you've got a conservative position that a person might hold where they would say, well, I think abortion should be restricted. However, I don't think that you should ban guns. Aren't they being a hypocrite too? Well, in actual fact, no, because there's an important distinction between the two actions here. It is not an intrinsic evil to own a firearm. It is not an intrinsic evil to shoot a firearm. An intrinsic evil, for those who don't know, is an act that is always evil, right? So it is not always evil to own a firearm and to shoot a firearm. However, if you're someone who's pro-life, then the deliberate killing of an innocent human being, which is always evil, it's an intrinsic evil, would apply to abortion, because obviously if you're pro-life, you hold the position that an unborn human being is entitled to the same basic right to life as the rest of us. And so therefore abortion would be an intrinsic evil, and owning a gun or firing a gun is clearly not an intrinsic evil, right? So there's a distinction there. So it's not hypocritical at all to hold a view that you could have allow people access to guns, but at the same time you should restrict the practice of abortion because of what it entails. As per usual, I'd love to know what you think in the comments section below, and I'm sure today that I'm going to get plenty of feedback on this issue because there's a lot of controversial and emotive stuff being said about this, but please let me know, do you agree, do you disagree? Let me know in the comments section below. If you like the content I'm producing and you want to see more of it, please support me on Patreon. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.